P.T. Logan's 5 Minutes of Terror. Twisted, troubling tales to send a chill up your spine.
Snake Eyes. Todd has lived next to the Landers his entire life, but he has never once spoken to them. Todd is a social guy and loves passing the time chatting with others. He's the type of guy who chats with the cashier at the grocery store, pets everyone's dog, and he knows the mailman's children's names. But for some reason, even though he's lived beside the Sanders for more than 20 years, he hasn't even said a single word to them. The Landers were the opposite of Todd. They kept to themselves and were rarely seen outside their home. They were homebodies, and Todd knew this because his kitchen window overlooked their family room. He often saw the three of them, Mr. and Mrs. and their teenage son, just sitting there, not appearing to speak and with no TV on. And sunglasses. They were always wearing sunglasses even inside, and on the rare occasion that Todd saw them outside, they wore them then too, even at night. Todd had no idea what the Landers did for work or what they did for fun. They were strange, undoubtedly, and this is probably what kept Todd away, because Todd was normal and they were not. But now, after his diagnosis, Todd figured he had nothing to lose. His visits to the grocery store were becoming less frequent and his walks shorter. Not as many pet owners to interact with. Even his old mailman had retired. So, with this in mind, Todd got a bottle of his very best wine that he'd been saving for a special occasion, and finally went over to meet his neighbors. Todd felt uneasy when he knocked on the door, a feeling that grew when no one answered for several seconds. I'll just leave the bottle here, he thought. But no sooner had he set the bottle down did the door open. Can I help you? Standing in the doorway was the youngest Landers, the one that he'd first seen 23 years ago when the Landers had moved in. And that was the first problem that Todd identified. The teenage Lander that had moved in all those years ago was still a teenager now. Didn't look like he'd aged a single day over that time. It's a different person, he thought. It has to be. The kid in the doorway was dressed all in black, and he was wearing dark sunglasses that hid his eyes. Hi, Todd stammered. I'm your neighbor, Todd. I know this must seem silly after all this time, but I just wanted to introduce myself. The kid in the doorway said nothing, and Todd shifted his weight to 1 foot. I'm really sorry to bother you. Mr. and Mrs. Landers suddenly appeared behind their son. Like the boy, they were wearing dark sunglasses and dark clothing. Hi, I'm Todd, your neighbor, he said again. Mr. Landers smiled. Hi, Todd. My name is Mr. Landers. This is Mrs. Landers. And this is our son, Little Landers. I'm sorry, but he doesn't speak much. What a strange way to introduce themselves, Todd thought. Mr. Landers picked up the bottle of wine from the stoop. Is this for us? Yes, of course. It's a very old bottle, a special vintage. Mr. Landers inspected the label. Yes, I love this here. This surprised Todd. You've had it before? Yes, and one's much older. Why don't you come in and have a glass? All of a sudden, Todd felt very uncomfortable. And, to top it off, he realized that Mr. and Mrs. Landers, like their son, looked exactly the same as they had on the day they moved in. No, I don't think. Please join us, Mrs. Landers said with a smile. I would love to chat. Todd could refuse many things, including a glass of his favorite wine, but he could not refuse a good chat. Okay, sure, he said at last, and then followed the Landers into their home. As he made his way to the family room, Todd looked at the many photographs on the walls. There were dozens of them, and while the background in each was different, ranging from old-fashioned, almost medieval, to present day, the people in them did not. It was the Landers, always the Landers, Mr., Mrs., and Little, and they were always wearing their sunglasses. And they always looked the exact same. Did you guys change the background on these photos, like on a computer? Todd asked as Mrs. Lander went to the kitchen and opened the wine. No, we just love to travel. Todd took a closer look at one of the pictures. He could have sworn that it was taken decades ago. How can this be? When there was no answer, Todd turned around, and then he almost fell over. Mr. Landers stood right behind him with a glass of wine in her hand. It's us, all right, Mr. Landers said, appearing behind his wife. But these pictures were taken years ago, and you look the same. How is that possible? Instead of answering, Mr. Landers reached up and removed his sunglasses. Todd's horror. The man's eyes were bright yellow, and his pupils ran vertically like snake eyes. Todd tried to back up, but little Landers grabbed him by the shoulder and held him in place. And then Mrs. Landers slowly removed her sunglasses, revealing the same snake eyes as her husband's. "Like this," Mr. Landers said. As Todd continued to watch, Mr. Landers started to shake all over. Tiny quivers at first, and then his whole body was rocking back and forth. Todd tried again to turn and run, but little Landers hissed in his ear. As Mr. Landers' shaking grew more violent, Todd heard a horrible tearing sound. And then Mr. Landers' skin began to peel off, starting from the crown of his head and moving all the way to his feet. The man had just shed his skin right in front of Todd's eyes. When it was finally over, a younger, newer version of Mr. Landers stared at Todd, and he was smiling as if nothing had just happened. Now, how about that wine and a good chat, Todd? What do you say?
P.T. Logan's 5 Minutes of Terror. Twisted, troubling tales to send a chill up your spine.